thank you very much to all of you. And by the time we get this fixed, I just remind people also on Zoom to share their questions. We will try to get them through our roundtable discussion, but maybe we can already start by acknowledging the fact that even though we've seen that there are debates on the various type of gender differences that might exist in the brain, in the biology, but also in the social behavior, these are not only a question of differences in terms of amplitude, like whether there might be a slight advantage for women, but it's also a question of variance, the distribution. And we see through Camille's talk, for example, that we have actually a large overlap between whatever you can take as a biological, psychological factors. But what is, I guess, very hard to assess is the strength of the effect of the organization, of the context, the social context, on those behaviors that we see at the end of the way. So I would like you to comment on this. How do you appreciate the size of the impact of the context, the social context, compared to whatever biological, psychological, individual features? If any of you want to, yeah, please, Gina.
Well, I think we have to be careful that we're not falling into the same trap that it's either biological or it's organisational, etc. I mean, I think, and we'll talk to Camille afterwards, but I think there's a lot of newer research demonstrating the impact of the culture on the biology. So the biology will change, and I think that's where we have to be careful not to spend a lot of time talking about research showing differences in the brain, because the brain will change, you know, from one day to the next, if you like, and that's quite difficult to capture in terms of, you know, biology accounts for 2%, and so the rest must be nurture, and it's 98% or something. I think we need to get away from that model.
Can I also respond? Yeah, because I think what's different, I guess, in what we do when we look in organizations, so we don't look at population samples or averages in the population. So I find it very important that if we look in organizations, there have already been a number of self-selection processes, right? So we have already the women who have chosen a STEM career, the women who have completed a PhD, the women who have a stated ambition to have a career in science. So perhaps it's not your average woman, but by the time they get to these positions in organizations, they are self-selected for being highly motivated, highly willing to go into counter-stereotypical job types, whatever. And then, so these people are the individuals who have already, how do you call it? Not violated, but disproved the stereotype, if you wish. And so they deserve to be treated like that. And they have probably already overcome more hurdles than their male, I think that's the cartoon as well, right? That they have already overcome more hurdles. So you can bet you that if there's a minority member in any organizational context, that they are more smart, more ambitious, more motivated, have had to overcome more difficulties even to get there. And so they deserve more support, not less support. And it's not perhaps your average population sample, but these are the people who are already there, and they should be helped, I think.
Yeah, oh, perfect. Yeah, so I completely agree. There's a lot of evidence that does show that the brain is plastic and can change when you're in different contexts or when you learn specific tasks and so forth. I think what I was trying to say during the presentation was that the extent to which we have these early biological factors and the extent to which these actually explain gender differences is not so clear, because they're not very easy to study either.
Okay, thank you. We had actually one question that was asked by a person registering for the workshop, asking about the so-called gender equality paradox, the fact that in supposedly more equal countries you see stronger differences in occupations between men and women. So they wanted to have your view on those issues.
Is this working? Yes. I did touch on that. I mean, the basic assumption of the gender equality paradox is, with respect to science, that in the more gender equal countries, like Scandinavian countries and Iceland, there is, and I quote, a level playing field. And I think the work that Naomi was talking about demonstrates that science and business organisations, etc., are not a level playing field. And if they want to argue, as they do, that, okay, we'll forget the idea that women can't do science because they're incompetent because of their biology. The newer version, the newer essentialist argument is that women don't do science because biologically they have different preferences, and this is where we get into the whole kind of people versus things argument. So I think it's not a paradox, actually. I think what we need to challenge is the idea that you're effectively blaming the women because they're choosing not to do science, and you don't blame science by saying, are you actually being appropriately inclusive? Do you retain your people? If you don't retain them, do you find out why?
Perhaps I can add a little bit to that. I think it also relates to the difference between what we call blatant sexism and more subtle or more modern forms of sexism. So if you live in a country where girls can't go to school, or women can't drive a car, or cannot be independent, then it's very obvious that there's something to fight for, and that people are very motivated to do that. But when you live in a country where it seems to be equal, then it's very easy to internalize also the choices that you make, which are being modeled by subtle forces in society. So it's also very easy for people themselves to not to recognize those implicit biases and to think, oh, it must be my personal choice. And also, even if you do, for instance, exit interviews of people leaving the organizations, of course people are not very keen to say, oh, I'm leaving because I think you're not taking me seriously, or you're not evaluating my competences. So they will, you know, they will perhaps use this face-saving strategy where they say, well, I'm leaving because I prefer to spend more time with my kids, but is that the real reason? You'd never know.
I think there are some studies now that, obviously there are more than some now, but a lot of studies have been interested in this gender paradox, and they do tend to look at specific behaviors. I can think of one that I read recently, which was on math performance in 15-year-olds, where they had a very large sample of individuals, and they were trying to see whether this correlation between developed countries and math performance was still there. And so, sorry, I'm trying to explain it very well. But basically, they found that once you control for the stereotypes, you don't see this association anymore.
Maybe we can have questions from the audience or the Zoom. Eliana, if you have...
I can start. I have two more technical questions for Camille. I will just merge them as one. So, regarding sex differences that you see, how were the categories built, the male and female? Is it by gender, or was it the chromosomes were tested? And the second question that I enchain is like, how are the intersex individuals treated, since they are 2% of the population? How are they accounted in your studies?
So we use data from the UK Biobank. We have the chance of having both self-reported sex and genetic sex, so they're chromosomal data. And so what we did is that when there was a mismatch between self-reported and chromosomal sex, we excluded those participants. We looked at sex based on the chromosomes. And as for intersex individuals, we did not take them into consideration in the study that we looked at, because one of the reasons we didn't do that was because we needed a lot of participants to reliably estimate these sex differences, and we didn't necessarily think that we would have enough to make reliable claims on whether or not there were differences within their brains compared to males and females.
have a question for Ms. Ellemers. Hartelijk bedankt voor een hele mooie presentatie, heel duidelijk. I can also imagine the chart that you showed at the end was very, very visual, representative of the problem. I was wondering whether or not it's also easier for organizations to deal with the first part, right, than for the later parts. It's easier to perhaps to understand, to open up your organization and to enforce some policies there. I'm really wondering if you can give some examples of how an organization can, as you say, celebrate differences, or in the end, follow up and make changes. Maybe some practical or some examples would be very helpful.
Yeah, so what we see there is actually that there are a lot of standard organizational practices that people think they are neutral or standard or objective or whatever. And when you look into them more precisely, you see that there are all kinds of ideas and biases in there. And so, for instance, looking at leadership requirements and then noting that these mainly invite assertive behavior, and so that's how leadership potential is defined. And so what you see in organizations that say, yeah, we want more women also in leadership positions, but they don't meet the criteria, and then we have this quota, internal quota in the organization. And then everybody's very frustrated because they say, well, we have these women and they actually don't meet the leadership criteria, but then in order to meet the quota, we still put them forward and everybody feels frustrated about it. And so I think they truly do not realize that their leadership criteria are very gender biased. And so even going through all these stages of their personnel policies and opening the eyes and saying, look, what are you rewarding here? What you are looking for here? This is really what you want, or is it just what you're used to? And can you see that it's actually a very particular type of leadership that you're inviting here, or that you're only looking at particular age groups? And so if somebody's beyond that age group because they say, for instance, I want to spend some time with my family these years, I don't want to do an extra step in my career, would there be an option for them to come in a later age group and to still be considered as a high potential? And when you go through all these steps, I think there's not a lot of resistance, but I think people truly don't realize how much implicit images that are stereotypically masculine in this case guide all their standard business practices. So you really have to go into the organizations and work with them. So we take them also for master classes, and we ask them to bring their own policies to the master classes and work with us in a series of meetings, and we try to really work with them and explain to them how they can do it, and you really have to sit with them because they don't see it. And so I think it's more a lack of understanding than a lack of motivation causing that.
I'd just add something to that. I've been working with a group of women in banking and finance and looking at the so-called missing middle about why, having got people in, they don't stay. And one large-scale survey was looking at behaviour in the workplace and attitudes towards it. And those organisations which were predominantly male, how they treated mistakes or errors. In predominantly male organisations, they were described as opportunities, learning opportunities. You know, this is, yes, we all make mistakes, but this is something that we can overcome. Whereas in organisations which were predominantly female, mistakes were treated as indications of incompetence. So in terms of the kind of thing that I was saying about negative and positive social experiences, you instantly have a kind of inbuilt bias which is going to drive people in different directions and make them behave differently. And it was unconscious, there was no, we must tell everybody this and tell everybody else this. It was just something which had emerged over time.
I can go for one. So we have a question from Mark. Since there doesn't seem to be a large biological sex difference, but rather external influences, should positive discrimination be promoted with these possible backstabs, or a more gradual cultural change should be envisioned?
Well, they say you can't be what you can't see, right? And so I do think, and of course the word quota or whatever, everybody thinks it means something different, and there's a lot of resistance against it. Actually, we've also done some research on that, so the higher the criterion, the more resistance there is against it. But so I like to think of those as what we call target numbers. And so to say, okay, given the number of women you have at a certain level, or given the number of women in this profession, what would be a realistic ambition? And just, you know, no, don't rely on the assumption that you treat everybody fairly, but test yourself against these target numbers. And that's a different way of saying you have to make sure you get these people on these positions, or otherwise everybody will think it is impossible.
So I would respond with another question. That it's a lot of women feel frustrated by being considered as diversity peaks. So how can we actually reconcile this?
Yeah, well, that's. I think it's general. It's also other minorities are resistant against policies that favor them because they say, I want to be selected for my own merits and not for who I am as a group member or whatever. And so they also don't necessarily acknowledge that there are unequal opportunities. Yeah, I think it's a lot, also depends on how it is being communicated in the organization, whether it's being communicated as, you know, we're favoring people, or saying, no, we're supporting people who are not getting enough support. And that's also a different way of thinking about it, I guess.
Yeah, and I'd add to that I think you need to get everybody on board. Because it can look like, you know, we need to fix the women kind of thing. So that you also need to say to everybody, this, you know, this will benefit you in whatever way you choose to prove that, and there is proof. So, you know, it could be that this will improve the work-life balance for the whole workforce, etc. So you sell it. I think you said it's much easier to get people to accept a positive message. So there is a reason for doing this, and it's going to be good for all of us.
I think we will have one last question. I just want, not spoiling, but let you know that this afternoon conference we actually will also address this issue of quotas and how it can backlash sometimes also through Pierre Deschamps' talk in particular, but others. So last question, maybe?
I think my question was mostly answered just now, but it was essentially touching on this topic of inclusion and feeling the talks by Dr. Rippon and Dr. Elina were very kind of centered around this feeling included being really important. And it really struck me as true, and I think it's important. But when we, in nowadays, we have these kind of courses, for example, for women in STEM, increasing women in STEM is quite a big topic in certain countries and certain institutions. And I worry sometimes that can lead to people, so not maybe women, but maybe in the male group who feel, like we've just discussed, kind of, feel like this is maybe not legitimate, maybe these people shouldn't be here, they're only here because they're a woman. And I think you answered that by saying we should increase the communication within the organisation about how this is not kind of, yes, it's rebalancing something. But I wonder if you could just talk about how this could be better communicated in terms of, it's not that they don't belong, they could have got there without that course, but this course is helpful to them. Could you maybe comment on that?
So what I can tell you is going back to this inclusiveness monitor, because we've been doing a lot of that with many different organizations. And there we found, so we simply asked people, do you feel that you're similar or that you're different from your colleagues in the workplace? And many people say, I feel different from my colleagues in the workplace. And then we said, why? And actually, quite a small proportion of these people said, because I'm the only woman or the only man, or because I'm the only person of color or whatever. And so, in addition to all these visible differences that are part of the diversity policy of the organization, the biggest finding that we observed was that there is a huge number of people out there who say, I feel different because I'm the only one with a different political orientation, or who is going to church every week, and I can never talk about this because nobody nobody goes to church anymore. Or, so all kinds of reasons why people felt out of place and felt different in ways that are not necessarily acknowledged and certainly not included in the diversity policies of the organization. So we are now working with these organizations to say, look, you shouldn't make policies for specific target groups. And also everybody then gets very nervous because for every new target group you make a new policy, and then who is left out from that and whatever. And so we say, no, you should perhaps forget about all these different target groups and singling them out, but just say, look, there are so many people who don't feel that they belong here or feel that they're different, and you don't even realize who they are, why this is the case. So you should be much more attentive to creating a workplace where many differences are possible and where people are being welcome to make mistakes or to have different opinions or whatever. And so this is where the benefit of diversity is, and not in focusing on particular target groups. And I guess if you can do that successfully, that could also take care of some of the concerns that you voiced just now.
I thought you were going to say sometimes the issue is, and it sounds like we might touch on this afternoon, that having courses like Women in STEM or Helping Women in STEM draws attention to the fact that women need help. And so you're perpetuating this idea that there's some kind of special pleading needed. So you probably need to change the spin. I mean, there's a great phrase, if you've got a leaky pipeline, don't blame the water. And I think that's very true with all these really well-meaning initiatives, but what you might just be doing is perpetuating the idea that you need some kind of... I mean, I'm not saying you don't need special help in terms of perhaps if there is some kind of bias in recruiting, but that needs to be addressed at that level. You know, if recruiting is biased against whoever, then we need to look at that rather than say, well, we'll change the criteria for women, because that sends the wrong message, I think.